My name is Paul Rosenzweig, and with me are Andrea, Nate, and Rich. Their bios are in your book, so I'm not going to waste any time talking about that. I want to start by wishing you all happy anniversary. 10 years ago, the iPhone was invented and introduced. Just 10 years ago, nobody in the world had a smart mobile phone device. Today, I'm going to guess there isn't a single person in the room who isn't carrying one. And more to the point, today, more than 3.5 billion people, roughly 47% of the world's population, has regular, routine access to the network. And that doesn't even count the Chinese, because we're not allowed to count them because they have to go to internet cafes to get a lot of their access. So it's actually understating the throughput. What that tells you is that in the last 10 years, the internet, the cyber network, has grown from a rarity that is barely used by a few rare individuals who use it for business purposes to something that is a commodity that spreads across the globe. And with that increased globalization comes an increased attention to differentiation across the globe. How different countries, different jurisdictions treat this network that fundamentally has no barriers in it. And that's the topic for our discussion today. So I'm going to start with you, Rich, down at the end. You work for a global company that has operations essentially worldwide. And your particular area of concern is essentially barriers to internet data flows, with a reference mostly to how governments are starting to interfere with those flows in different ways. So in this post-Edward Snowden world, what do you see as some of the biggest threats to global data network flows? And what do you think are some of the opportunities out there that people should be looking at? Give us an intro.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for inviting me here today and to be able to talk to you about these issues. So I think you're right, Paul. And you started out with the right message about how significant the global networks are to all of us. Kind of snuck up on us very quickly. 10 years isn't really all that long ago. And I think if this had been even 2 or 3, maybe 3 years ago, and I was up here, I would spend some time talking about how global networks are so important to the economy and how this is going to be our future. I don't need to do that anymore. We all know it. And it's just a truism now, which I think is a good thing, because there really has been, I think, the benefits of global networks and like the dream of these computer systems that are seamless and so low latency. I think that has come true. We've probably surpassed expectations of where we were a couple of years ago about how valuable this turned out to be, and the savings to companies and the savings to government to be able to use these large networks, many of which are offered by private sector, the Amazons, Googles, Microsofts, and others out there who provide these services, often for free. So it's turned out to be spectacular for the economy, for productivity. I think there's security advantages to this, all things that I'm sure we'll talk about on the panel today. One thing that is clear is that to really be able to get full advantage of this global network, people have to be willing to trust it and to be able to use it and rely on it. And it's not just a matter of getting them to believe it's safe, but it means let's really make it safe. Let's give them reason for trust. And there are some barriers to trust right now. I think the revelations that we saw with Snowden brought to the surface some of the concerns that a lot of us had in the back of our heads already about government access to data. The breaches that we've seen into networks give people pause about, well, okay, even if there's this government thing, we also have unauthorized access by attackers, maybe competitors in some situations, maybe nation states and others. And that gives rise to some concern about being willing to put the data in the cloud and be able to get all the benefits of it. So I think that's that's really kind of at a high level, the biggest barrier right now, I think, to the continued growth. For companies like Google and others, and I won't speak for Microsoft, but I suspect it's the same, one of the things that we've really got to focus on is making sure that the rules around government access to data make sense, that people understand what they are and they agree with them. and that if there's a disconnect with what people understand are the rules around government access to data and what the rules are, we get those fixed up. And Google and Microsoft and a bunch of other companies have for many years now been working on essentially a suite of proposals to try to align what people's expectations are about how data is handled and disclosure to the government and what the rules really are. So I think that is one of the biggest areas right now for us to work on, is the reformation of, maybe that's even to maybe updating of the laws around government access to data, both in the United States and outside of the United States, so that the rules make sense, they're clear, and more important than that, we all agree that those are the right rules about what is required for the government to be able to get access to data.
Give us a couple of specifics. What would be your personal, not even speaking for Google, top 2 priorities where you see that disconnect between what the world expects and what the world actually delivers?
A classic example of this is there's a statute in the United States, some of you are going to be very familiar with it. It's called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, otherwise lovingly known as ECPA, kind of this obscure statute. It was passed in 1986, so even really pre-web. There wasn't much in 1986 except for the computer graduate students in the basements of universities using their big Univax machines and connecting to the internet. But 1986 was when this statute was passed, and it was actually a pretty a lot of foresight by Congress in seeing that 1986, we need a special statute to govern how government accesses data from companies that hold it on behalf of their users. Remarkable that they even thought of this problem. And we got some rules back in 1986. It kind of made sense back then, given the limited nature of the internet, but we haven't updated those in meaningful ways since 1986. And things have changed quite a bit. And one of the set of rules, there's this really complicated set of rules around when the government can get the content of your communications when it's stored with a third-party provider, whether it's a company that's storing their corporate data with a provider or it's an individual. And it turns on how old is let's use an email as an example. How old is the email? Is it over 180 days old? Well, then you don't really have much of a privacy interest and the government can get it with a simple subpoena with maybe notice to you, maybe not notice to you. Has it been read and you left it with the service provider, you didn't delete it? Well, you probably don't have an expectation of privacy in that either because you left it there. So again, you could get it with a simple subpoena. So really silly rules, and rules that we look at now and are sort of startled by, although we've been living with them for a while. That's something that can be easily fixed. We've got a fix that Senator Leahy and Lee and Yoder and Polis on the House side have been pushing. It's probably the single most popular piece of legislation in Congress right now, having a little bit of a hard time getting it over the goal line. But that's an easy one, where it would change the rule so that the government in the United States needs a search warrant to be able to get to your content that's stored with a third-party provider. They have to have a probable cause showing, and a judge has to sign off on it, and there's particularity requirements, all these things that come with search warrants. To me, that's a no-brainer. And I think people are surprised to hear that that's not the statutory rule. The nice thing about it is the courts, I used to be surprised by this, but I'm not anymore. The courts are actually moving quicker than Congress to fix this. And so we actually have court decisions that say, whatever that statute says is fine. It's the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution that requires a warrant here. So Congress's statute and these rules are whatever Congress thinks is one thing, but the Constitution actually requires a warrant. So I think that's a classic example of the disconnect.
So let me turn to you, Nate, and modulate the question just a bit. Richard's talked a little bit about the dissonance between customer expectations and government activity. Let me ask you a little bit about the prospect of being caught between two governments or between competing legal demands. How do you see that from a global perspective? I know Microsoft has an ongoing case in the Second Circuit, and you can speak to that maybe if you want to, and tell us what would happen if you won the case or what would happen if you lost the case. But more to the point, tell us how a global corporation has to deal with conflicting legal imperatives from, in this case, possibly Europe and America.
It's a good question. I mean, we have. Sorry.
There you go. No, it's okay.
We have, I think, seeing the environment grow more and more chaotic over time. We've always faced this challenge. I mean, foreign governments, for U.S. providers, governments outside of the United States have come to us for a long time seeking information about our users. And typically, particularly when it comes to content, the standard process for U.S. providers is to direct them to the MLAT process in the United States. And
why don't you spell that out?
The mutual legal assistance process, basically what it is the U.S. government enters into treaties with foreign governments and commits to assist them in gathering evidence related to legitimate criminal investigations. So when they seek information from a U.S. service provider like Microsoft or Google or Yahoo or others, they submit a formal request to the United States. The United States, if there's sufficient information to support a search warrant in the case of content, they'll actually go into the court, apply for a search warrant, serve it on Microsoft, we disclose the information, and they turn it over to the foreign government. There is, as part of ECPA, the statute that Richard mentioned earlier, there's a blocking statute, so to speak, that prohibits us from disclosing content except in a limited set of circumstances, and complying with legal process from a foreign government is not one of those circumstances that we're allowed to disclose. And so it is something we've faced for a very long time, but I think over time the environment's grown chaotic. I mean, we have, as Richard mentioned, the laws in the U.S. have on this, the quintessential law, ECPA, has not been updated in 29 years. The same is true of most other countries in the world as well. These laws were largely written, before the advent of the internet as we know it today, and I think, what you fundamentally have is borderless technology that has advanced quite significantly in recent years, and we're still living in a Westphalian system where nation states have a say in things. They have laws that they expect us to apply when they apply to us, and it's getting, I think, increasingly more complicated. You're seeing states become more and more aggressive in asserting their authority.
Give me an example.
Let's see. For us, Microsoft, one of our subsidiaries that we own is Skype, a VoIP communication service. Currently, this is public knowledge. It's been reported in the press. They're being prosecuted in Belgium for failure to comply with a wiretap order under Belgian law, which we've made a variety of arguments against. But you still have, I think, nation states pursuing their own interests, which are to protect their own people's security and the privacy of their own people. And that's a very sensible thing in our estimation. But in a lot of cases, they're not taking account for the global nature of the service and the way it really operates. Telecommunication services historically have had infrastructure in places around the world, and they're able to comply with local law on local infrastructure. We are, I think, increasingly finding ourselves in a situation where countries are imposing blocking statutes and extraterritorial demands for data, and those things are increasingly in tension. And part of this, I think, is a failure of the MLAT process to deliver on the demand that's out there for this. And so, I think what Rick and I and others in the industry have been talking a lot about lately is how do you develop a system that works for the internet as it exists today? And I think that involves two things. One is updating domestic laws, ensuring that it establishes an adequate level of trust and privacy for our users, but also updating the international system. There's got to be a way to reconcile these obligations across borders. It's been done in the MLAT historically. We're open to looking at new mechanisms for doing this, but increasingly we are seeing governments, the United Kingdom introduced legislation just yesterday to reenact some laws that they passed last year, among other things. And one of their primary goals that they have stated is to make their interception and data access laws extraterritorial and applicable to U.S. companies, among others. It applies equally to German providers and providers in Africa and Asia. And I think our biggest concern at this point is not just the trust of our users and their privacy, which is obviously fundamental for us, but it's also how do we operate in a global system that's becoming increasingly more and more chaotic over time. I think our case in New York, for those who aren't familiar with it, we received a search warrant back in 2013 now for a single user of our Outlook.com email service. It's a free consumer email service. The data that was sought was actually stored exclusively in an overseas data center in Dublin, Ireland. And we filed a challenge to the search warrant, arguing that warrants historically in the US system have been limited to US territory. They can't knock down a door in Dublin, Ireland and search a home. How does a warrant reach outside of the United States and compel us to disclose data that's physically located there? The government obviously has a very different view and argues it's essentially a hybrid warrant subpoena that can compel us to gather up documents overseas, bring them back and disclose them. But I think, even setting aside the legal arguments, which I find interesting, as a nerd who lives, eats, and breathes this stuff, I think what it does is it highlights a lot of these conflicts of cross-border data requests, the implications, not just for us, but for the government and diplomatic relations with these other countries. And so I would say it's not a new problem, but I would say it's growing more and more complicated and more contentious over time.
Well, that's a great lead into you, Andrea, because Nate mentioned at least two instances, one involving a data center in Dublin, another involving a prosecution in Brussels. Obviously, one of the biggest trading partners for the United States and one of the predominant alliances is the transatlantic work between America and the European Union. Yet many see in this increasingly globalized economy a growing dissonance between European approaches and American approaches that are either catching companies in the middle or creating political problems for US and EU interactions as they look to people who have even more different views, like China or Russia. Do you see the dissonance growing? Do you see it narrowing? How is, you're the only government representative here, which is interesting. We don't have an American government representative on board, but we do have one from the EU. How do you see a way forward to resolving the tensions that Nate and Rich have addressed? And particularly, let's focus on US and EU interaction, because we're not going to be able to fix the China issue on this panel, at least not in the next, not before lunch.
We have, yeah. So thank you. I know you don't want to lose time by giving our bias, but let me just say I think it's helpful to contextualize my intervention, also the discussion, that as it was mentioned, I work for the European Union, more specifically for the European Commission, which is the executive body of the European Union. I do not work for member states' governments. I think this is important to keep in mind. I do not represent them, and they can have the opinion they want. More often than not, the European Commission, the entity I work for, actually, we don't like to do it, but it happens that we actually bring our own member states to court to comply with European Union law. I think this is important to keep in mind. Now, to get to your question and to your point, look, I think it's a matter, very often it's a matter of perspective, and it's a matter of confirmation bias or selection bias. Those who do statistics know that. If you read the media, yes, you would assume that we're basically, our alliance is splitting, because every other day there is an article on newspapers on what Europeans are doing or what Americans are doing, and we are protectionistic, and the big bad Americans are spying on us. I think we need to get a little bit more adult about these conversations. And when it comes to intelligence, somebody in the field once told me that spying, as he called it, is the second oldest profession in the world, and it is often combined with the first oldest profession in the world. So it's not going to go away anytime soon, and everybody does it. And likewise, when it comes to so-called claims of protectionism in Europe, at the end of the day, both the US and Europe, our countries, we have laws to enforce, we have citizens to protect, and I don't think that's useful to make any claims on whether the reasons why we do certain things is because we want to advantage our industry. I don't believe that is the case. Now, if you go beyond the media reporting, and the article in newspapers. Let me give you one quick example, and I will quote the company, I will mention the company simply because it's public information. Some time ago, there was an investigation. The European Commission opened an antitrust investigation. I think it was on, if I remember correctly, on Amazon terms and conditions for e-books. Now, I might have to recheck that. We do a lot of antitrust investigation, and most of them are not on American companies, by the way. 95% of them are on European companies. And of course, here in the US, you have these huge first pages on newspapers. So now Europe was, that hell-bent on penalizing American companies. A few months later, the European Commission concluded its preliminary investigation saying, actually, there is no problem. Amazon is doing fine. There is no violation of the rules. Did you see any article on that? Did you see anything on newspapers that actually we did what we were supposed to do, and we concluded that the rules have been respected? So I think we should go beyond the media reporting. With all due respect to the media, they do an essential job in democracies, but they do it in their own particular way. And we should keep in mind that, as you mentioned, Paul, at the end of the day, we have an alliance that dates back decades. We are the largest trading bloc in the world. It's interesting to remember that there are more investments of American companies in Belgium, to mention the country was mentioned before. There are more investments of American companies in Belgium than in the whole of China. And Belgium is, with all due respect, a small company within a small country, within the European Union. So we have these huge economic ties. We have also cultural and value ties. We might have slightly different ways to pursue the objectives that we have, whether it comes to security, whether it comes to privacy, economic growth, etc. But those values are common, and as you said, we have definitely more in common between the two of us than either of us has with other countries on the east of Europe or in your west, depending on where you start from. Then you have to look at the specific cases, and I agree with what has been said by my fellow panelists that yes, there are tensions. It's unavoidable. Technology tends to upset existing rules. I can't comment on the specific cases that you mentioned on the Belgian investigation. I'm aware of that case, but as I said, that is something that for the time being concerns the national law enforcement authorities of Belgium, and I'm not in a position to comment on that. Nor will I comment on the Microsoft Ireland case. I will just say that that is something we're following extremely closely. Not so much because it concerns one of our member states, but also because we really believe that this is a case that will have far-reaching implications on how we deal with the general tension that has been described in the years to come. So whatever solution will be found at the end, I believe we will need to pay a lot of attention to it because it might be replicated in other cases as well. And on this note, let me point out, I'm not suggesting that, Microsoft is doing whatever it has to do in that case, and that's Microsoft's business. But as you might be aware, Brad Smith, who I think is President and Chief Legal Officer of Microsoft, and very much an expert in privacy law, including European privacy law, has recently posted a blog post on the official Microsoft blog in which he suggested a number of solutions on how to deal with this tension between what has been called our Westphalian system, and the cross-border nature of the internet when it comes specifically to the handling of personal data. He basically proposed something which we find very interesting. By the way, this is not an official support to the European Commission, to Brad Smith's idea, but we do find it very interesting, and we would love to have a broader debate on that, which is basically, and I'm simplifying very much, but at the end of the day, it's the idea that it doesn't really matter where the data is stored. It doesn't really matter whether it's in Ireland, in the US, it's in China, or etc. What matters is who that data refers to. And if the data, personal data, to use European terminology, refers to a European citizen, then European law should apply. If it's data of a US citizen, the US law should apply. Now, this is very simplistic, and there will need to be a lot of discussion on that, but we think that, or at least certainly I think, that is a very interesting approach. And I will also note that, as you might know, in Europe, we are in the process of reviewing our data protection legislation, privacy legislation. We have this directive, which dates back to 1995. As it has been mentioned, many of these laws were done in late 80s, early 90s. We are now reviewing that. We have this so-called draft General Data Protection Regulation, which updates those rules. And one key rule that the European Commission has proposed, and our parliament and the member states are debating, concerns jurisdictional application of those rules. And our proposal, which as far as I can see should remain in the final version, is that actually, again, it doesn't matter where you as a company are located, it doesn't matter where the data is located, but if you are targeting, monitoring, or using personal data of European citizens, then European Union law should apply. So we are very much in sync there. Some companies like that, a lot of other companies, with all due respect, a lot of American companies, 2 years ago when we introduced the overall rules, including this rule, lobbied us very heavily against these rules. I think, bluntly, I think that approach was myopic, because at the end of the day, you got to decide, if you want to have a Westphalian approach, as it seems to me in the Microsoft Ireland case the US government wants, well, you have to be careful what you ask for, because very soon another country will come to you and will tell you, actually, the data one of our citizens is stored in your systems, we want it. And so you got to decide, you have to have a coherent in this approach. Are we coherent in Europe? We try to. I think what is very important at this point in time, whether it's about counterterrorism, security, privacy, anything that relates to these issues, is that between Europe and the US, we keep the dialogue open. We need to be honest with each other. We need to go beyond the rhetoric that you hear sometimes on all these matters. Because, again, let me repeat it, let me stress it, for me, for us, this is very important. We should not lose sight of the big picture here, and the big picture is that we are allies, we are economic partners, and we have far more in common when it comes on the global stage, what's happening on the global stage, than either of us has with any other country out there.
Yeah,
Can I just respond to that?
Sure, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I wanted to clarify one thing that, I'm not saying the Westphalian system and borderless technology can't coexist. I actually agree very much with Andrea that I think there is a way to square the circle, so to speak. And, what we've been talking about at Microsoft for quite a long time now is, if two partners are going to be able to come together and resolve this, I think it probably is the EU and the US. And I think there's a great opportunity to do that. And I think they have, not only shared values, but also shared challenges. I mean, they're both sides of the Atlantic are very interested in protecting users' privacy. They're interested in promoting, use of the cloud for, as Rick mentioned, security and economic reasons, and they're, interested in promoting their own security and addressing challenges like terrorism and other things. And I think, one of the things that we've struggled with, as I mentioned earlier, are, we get requests from, the UK government or the Belgian government about investigations they're running of their own citizens who've committed crimes in their own country against other, fellow citizens of that country, and they come to us and ask for the data, and we say, go through the MLAT process in the US and, ask the US government to get it. To me, I don't know that system really makes sense. There's got to be a more effective way of doing it. Why does US law prohibit us from complying with a British request about a British national who committed a crime in Britain? It's not a sensible system, frankly, and I think, if people can just sit down across the table from each other and work through these things, there's a path to a better system. There will be challenges, there will be difficult issues to confront, but I do think there's light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak.
So, Rich, let me turn to you. And this whole idea of a Westphalian thing, the peace of Westphalia, sovereign nations are in charge. They assert authority over their borders and their citizens. It's a very old idea. And what Andrea and Nate have been talking about is an effort to get beyond that but we're going to face challenges, because even if we could come to grips with that in a US-EU exchange, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, they're all global companies, and a large fraction of the world is not quite as respectful of some of these principles of internet freedom as we might say. Authoritarian countries around the globe are jumping on this Westphalian idea with both feet, asserting, I read about a conflict with China just yesterday or 3 days ago, I guess, over the .xyz domain. And I don't even understand that one yet, so I'm not going to ask you about that. But how does a global company, all of this is all good, happy talk for the possibility of resolution between like-minded nations like America and the EU and the European countries. How does a global nation, a global company like you, respond to China, Russia, top Tajikistan, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I do think, and just to add on to Nate and Andrea's discussion, this really is a government-to-government issue to get it resolved, where one country wants to assert their equities, which conflict with another country's equities. They need to work it out, obviously open in a transparent way so that we can all have our voices heard in how it gets resolved. And I do think it makes sense. There are certain countries where this should not be that difficult to do. To get it resolved so that UK investigator can investigate that UK crime without running into a conflict with US law when the data is held by a US company. And other countries should be able to do the same thing. I think theoretically you could have that same arrangement with a China and a Russia and other regimes where at least there's an operating functional government where you've got just a chaotic mess in some country that's undergoing civil unrest. It's going to be really hard to do that. But where there is a central authority that you can work with, might actually be able to have a system like that. We're not there yet. We're not even there yet with EU countries. So we've got a ways to go. But I don't think that's insurmountable. The current situation where you've got a country that's investigating a crime. They're not really a regime that respects human rights. They don't really have rule of law. They may have some laws on the books that look good. That's not how it actually operates there. Those are troubling situations for companies where you can help and it makes sense. It's a legitimate investigation. There's no serious privacy interests that'll be invaded as far as your user goes. You like to be able to work with the investigative agency. There are certainly places where you're just not going to be sure any of those things are true. That's when having diplomatic mechanisms like the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty process that Nate mentioned, or this other obscure thing called letters rogatory, or just informal cooperation between countries to help in investigations really comes in handy and becomes essential, so that the country that comes to us with requesting information about a user that may very well have been in that country and may very well have committed a murder and may very well have used a service of a US company that contains evidence of that crime, maybe even could prevent other crimes, actually does have a mechanism to be able to get the information, but through the US government. And that's actually how it works now with a lot of jurisdictions.
So then if I could characterize your position, and feel free to tell me I'm wrong, the sweet spot for Google, for Microsoft, for American global companies in this new world is, what you want from the US government is, with respect to friendly regimes that they can do business with, like the EU, to negotiate some kind of global umbrella agreement that makes life easy for you, gets the governments out of the way. But with respect to authoritarian regimes, kind of stand a bit as your protector and interpose themselves so that you don't have to be completely subservient or overly at the risk of responding to places like Russia or China.
I think that's largely right. I mean, your characterization of whatever the mechanism is with the EU and all, I don't know. I'm agnostic to that. But I think you're right. I think there's still going to be a rule. We're not going to get away from countries being countries and acting as countries, but where there are shared interests and you can get treaty arrangements or whatever it is to help facilitate where there actually is a consistency in their equities, it's going to make sense. And that could even include repressive regimes at times. But where there's not, you're going to have to fall back on domestic laws and deal with the existing mechanisms for countries to deal with each other.
Okay, so that brings us to kind of like today's big issue, or this month's big issue, which is, we've tried that global overarching agreement sort of idea at least once with the EU, dating back to early in the last decade with what was called the Commercial Safe Harbor Agreement, the idea that there would be self-certification of privacy compliance across the Atlantic that would allow lots of commercial data flows. The European Court of Justice tossed that agreement out. I guess just a month ago, October 6th.
6th of October.
6th of October, so today we're on the 5th of November. So that seems to me to be a real challenge to the idea that we can solve this on an intergovernmental level when the courts, at least in Europe, and I imagine the ones in America, might intervene and strike down such global agreements between governments. Tell us a little bit about the EU ECJ Safe Harbor decision and what you see as a way forward to kind of resurrecting the idea of government-to-government solutions for global data flows that would make life easier for Microsoft and Google and Yahoo and Bing and everybody else who's on our sponsor list.
And also saving the world in the next 5 minutes.
Save
right?
the world in the next
Okay.
5 minutes. Yes, you have 5 minutes before we turn to questions from the audience.
Cool. Before I'm happy you asked the question. I was actually waiting for usually. Those questions arrive in the first 5 or 10 minutes, so I'm very happy to try to address that. But before I do that, let me very briefly make 2 considerations. The first, that maybe not everybody is aware that independently of what happened with the European Court of Justice decision, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, we have just, the European Union plus its member states and the US government have just concluded a different agreement, the Umbrella Agreement on exchange of data for law enforcement purposes, which has been initialed, as the diplomatic term is, and is waiting for ratification on our side. It's waiting for the passage of the Judicial Redress Act on your side. That was one of the conditions. That agreement is a very solid agreement for the exchange of law enforcement data across the spectrum, and it simply signals that, as I said at the beginning, you need to have perspective there. Yes, we might have an issue with the safe harbor system, but we have just concluded the other agreement. We have had a lot of cooperation with the TFTP, the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program, PNR, exchange of personal name records for security purposes. So the sky is not falling, this is what I'm trying to say, and we have been having this kind of cooperation between Europe and the US on many different fields when it comes to data and cyber issues and general criminality or counterterrorism for a long time, and we will certainly continue to have it. Now, on the recent decision of the European Court of Justice, which many folks in the room are probably aware of, but just to remind everybody, this is the result of a complaint which was raised by an Austrian citizen, Maximilian Schrems, against Facebook in Ireland, to the Data Protection Authority of Ireland, concerning the way in which actually Max Schrems did, I think, 25 or 26 different complaints, but the one that actually led to this case concerned the way in which Facebook was or was not actually sharing data with the US government for security purposes. The Irish DPA said that basically Max Schrems did not have standing and tossed out the complaint on the basis of and one of the arguments of the Irish DPA was that because we have the safe harbor agreement, then we don't even need to look at this complaint. And I want to stress this point because with all possible respect to the Irish Data Protection Authority, DPAs as we call them, have often not a lot of resources and are faced with very difficult choices, but quite frankly, and the European Court of Justice recognized that was not the way in which safe harbor was ever meant to work. Safe harbor is not a get out of jail for free card that tosses out, that excludes any responsibility for the national enforcement authorities to actually investigate the specific claim. And we at the Commission, we never claimed that, to be absolutely clear. In any case, then the case went up and up and up through the Irish court and to the Irish High Court. And I should point out that throughout that procedure, many of the parties that are now complaining that in the European ruling, the court got it wrong, throughout these preliminary steps, those parties had the opportunity to present facts, to present their views, and they chose not to do it. So now it seems a bit cheap, quite frankly, to claim that the court got the facts wrong. We all know that there is a thing as reality and there is a thing as legal reality, and of course look at the legal reality, the facts that are presented to them. Be it as it may, the whole case went up to the European Court of Justice, which, let me remind all of you, is the top court of the European Union. There is no appeal, there is no negotiation, it's like your US Supreme Court, so as far as we, and with all possible respect, you are concerned, this is the law of the land in the European Union. And I'm saying that because there are plenty, not plenty, but there have been some observation or some proposals, especially from the business side in Europe, in the US, or can we somehow, find smart solutions to the ruling, and we have to tell them, no, that those are our new parameters, and we have to do what the court told us. And what did the court say? The court said that 2000 Safe Harbor Agreement did not take into due account a number of safeguards that should be present for the personal data of European Union citizens to be transferred to third countries, in this specific case, the United States of America, concerning specifically the possibility for European citizens to have redress, judicial redress, when they feel that their rights are being violated, as well as whether there is a mass and indiscriminate access to personal data of European citizens, again, when the personal data is transferred to the US. On this and some other technical basis, the court annulled the safe harbor, the 2000 safe harbor decision. It's also important to keep in mind that this happened after, in 2013, the European Commission, following, and it's a term I don't like very much because I don't think they were revelations, to be absolutely honest, for anybody who has been doing any work in the intelligence field, what people call the Snowden revelations, and the cooperation between US companies with the US intelligence agency should not have come as a revelation, much as the cooperation that exists between the private sector and the public sector in many other countries of the world. But just for the sake of discussion, following those revelations, the European Commission, back in 2013, we were requested by the European Parliament to suspend the Safe Harbor Agreement back in 2013, and we said, no, we are not going to suspend it. We are going to work with our allies, the US, to strengthen the Safe Harbor Agreement. And we came up with a set of 13 recommendations, many of which actually anticipated the kind of problems that the court found in the system. And we have been working with the US government to address those issues, and this is a conversation we've been having since November 2013 with the US government, and it's still ongoing. Now, what's happening now is that on the basis of the ruling, because as I said, that ruling is the new law of the land, as far as we're concerned. So we had to make sure that whatever new agreement we came up with, and we want to come up with, the European Commission on the day of the ruling clearly went on record saying we want data flows to continue. That's our position. It should not be misunderstood in any way or form, but we have to do it in a way that respects the rights of European citizens as interpreted by our top court. So we are continuing those conversations. A number of issues that we had raised with the US government frankly have more or less been solved. They concern mostly the possibility for data protection authorities to work with the Federal Trade Commission in enforcing the Safe Harbor Agreement and so on and so forth. There are a few other issues, and this is not a secret, in which we are still trying to understand with our US friends and allies what's the best way to address them, concerning specifically the extent to which intelligence activities in the US are compatible, are clear, so the information of what's actually happening is clear, and the extent to which that is compatible with the parameters that the court has given us. I'm not going to give deadlines. I'm not going to tell you it will be solved in 1 month, in 2 months, in 3 months. I think right now we should focus on the substance because, and I will conclude here, and of course if there are questions, I'm happy to take them. We should keep very, very firmly in mind that the moment we come up with a new safe harbor, some people call it safe harbor 2.0, some people call it safer safe harbor. We don't have an official position on what the name should be. We'll see, my media colleagues in Brussels will come up with a funky name whenever we will have that text, the text on the table. But people should realize that the exact moment in which we adopt that new framework, the new agreement, it will be challenged again in court immediately. And the last thing that I want, that the Commission wants, that business wants, that all of us want, is that that new agreement is struck down a second time after 3 months or 4 months of the first ruling.
Well, for those who want to talk more about the safe harbor, Andrea has graciously agreed to host a Birds of a Feather table. It's one of the ones out there. But we've got a little bit time. Questions. People want to ask some stuff from the panel. Raise your hands. We've got microphones. First one, the lady there in white. Please tell us who you are.
Hi, Lisa Donner from Beyond Trust. So this would be really probably for Richard or for Nate. What's your views with your firms on the recent Senate passing of CISA, the Cyber Information Sharing Act?
You can go ahead.
I'm not the CISA expert at Microsoft, so I'll pass to Rick if he knows Google's position.
My understanding is procedurally it's going to go to markup, and we'll see what comes out of it. We're looking at it as we understand the reasons behind the bill. I think Google feels like when it comes to the information sharing provisions in particular, that we have plenty of authority to share information when we think we need to under current law with the government. So not a whole lot of interest in that particular provision in there. The current law says that providers are allowed to report crimes, for example, if they detect them on their network. And there are some other provisions in there that allow companies to, when they need to approach the U.S. government, and get a case going. And we do that. I've gotten myself a team of investigators who investigates crime at Google, and at times it looks like something might be significant enough that it's worthy of law enforcement interest, and we'll make a referral to law enforcement, and then they can continue investigating with legal process. That system seems to work for us. And so we're happy with that. So I don't really have any other comments with regard to CISA other than I don't see ourselves as particularly interested in the additional provisions that it seems to provide.
Next question. Down here in the front, gentlemen, wait for the mic. Tell us who you are, please.
Hi, Mike Coombs with Global Cybersecurity. Just a question in general. There's inherent tensions built into the system of the internet governance as it exists today between ICANN and their approach where governments only have one voice, not the entire voice, or ITU. It's been frustrating for governments because they're used to governing and they don't always get to do that. But there's also tension with things like the MLAT. And I know that in the Microsoft case, it's interesting that MLAT was not used by the US government or by the Belgian governments. And I think part of the potential problem with that is that the MLAT system does not work efficiently in the US.
Yeah.
It's been acknowledged by DOJ and state. They're working to improve it. So would it be better for Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, whoever is faced with these issues to put more pressure on the US government to actually improve their internal process for processing MLAT rather than trying to invent a new system?
Yeah.
That sounds like a softball, Nate.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
You don't answer yes, I'm going to.
I haven't played baseball in quite a while, but I'll try. I think we are doing that. We've worked with the U.S. Department of Justice for quite a long time. We've had a lot of conversations with them about how to improve their internal process to gain efficiencies. There are resources constraints that they have. I mean, with ECPA and the non-disclosure obligations we have there, you basically have, made the U.S. government, for all intents and purposes, the arbiter of other people's investigations that involve digital information in the possession of U.S. companies. And so it is a system that's bogged down, and in my view, understandably so. And I think there are a lot of solutions to gain efficiencies, but I don't think those efficiencies will ever truly solve the problem, just given the volume of the problem we face. And that's why I think we've concluded it needs to be complemented with some other approach, like we were talking about earlier, where you allow certain governments to come directly to companies under, certain limited circumstances that everybody can agree upon, like where they're investigating their own citizens. And that alone will, I think, take a lot of pressure off of the MLAT process. You have the UK using the MLAT process to investigate UK citizens in the UK. And you cut those out, you're gonna gain efficiencies by definition. So,
I'd like, if I may, to address briefly the point that the gentleman made about internet governance and ICANN and whether governments feel frustrated. I can't speak for all the governments in the world, of course. I can tell you, however, that certainly the position of the European Commission, and as far as I can see, by and large, with some very minor caveats, the position of European Union member states, we went on record multiple times, and I think we also behave, showing that we believe in the so-called multi-stakeholder model, in which there are different parties at the table. We do not believe that government should have the last word on each and every single issue. We also believe, though, that if you give certain responsibilities to a private sector company or organization, such as ICANN, well, that organization has to perform and to behave with a certain baseline in terms of accountability, transparency, absence of conflict of interest. What you cannot have is basically a situation in which the private sector tells us, look, we can fix a number of issues, including protecting consumers and helping the respective rights of those users, freedom of expression, blah, 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 but then not put in place the necessary procedural protection, substantive protection. And I'm not even talking about the jurisdictional issue here. ICANN is a US-based organization, but we don't have, frankly, we don't have an issue with that. We think that we can sort it out. So as people will know, ICANN is in a process to strengthen its own accountability with the work of a number of volunteers, and a number of volunteers are also coming from European companies and countries. So we're looking forward to that process. We do not believe, and again, we said it multiple times, the International Telecommunication Union and other UN organizations or international organizations have a number of essential functions to perform. And by and large, given the complexity of the world in which we live, I think they're performing it rather pretty well. It's easy to criticize those organizations. I would like to see a number of companies trying to do the same thing with the same constraints that those organizations, international organizations, do. But be it as it may, those organizations, the ITU and others, they perform a number of important functions. It doesn't mean, from our perspective, that they should also perform the kind of governance functions that ICANN and other multi-stakeholder organizations are performing. And that is an official position which we have repeated plenty of times.
Well, that's great. We are reaching the end of the time, so I'm going to ask the last question. One-word answer. One-word answer. Better or worse? 10 years from now, is government interference with global data flows worse or better?
Oh, better.
Better.
It depends.
And on that ambiguous note, I want to thank the panelists for joining us. I want to thank all of you for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.